Steven Seagal is a name synonymous with action movies and martial arts. Known for his tough guy persona and impressive fighting skills, he rose to fame in the late 80s and 90s as one of Hollywood's biggest action stars. However, as the years have passed, questions have been raised about Seagal's career and his claims about his life and experiences. Seagal has built a reputation as a larger-than-life figure, but how much of his persona is actually true? Despite many of the controversies and allegations made against and about Seagal, he still maintains a dedicated fanbase and continues to work within the industry today. So let's take a look at the complex legacy of Steven Seagal, one of Hollywood's biggest liars. Seagal's early life is something that's a bit hard to really pin down, because what he says in interviews varies pretty wildly from interview to interview, and also what his parents have said about his early life. At times, Seagal has mentioned coming up in Detroit and learning blues on his front porch. In actuality, he was born in Lansing, Michigan and raised there until he was around 5 years old. And while Lansing isn't that far from Detroit in the grand scheme of things, it's an hour drive. I doubt his parents were taking a kid under 5 into Detroit to learn the blues. But maybe he actually learned blues on his front porch in Fullerton, California, where he moved with his family when he was 5. In fact, he claims that Clarence Gatemouth Brown was a mentor. He claims that he would stay in his house in California and watch cartoons. Of course, there's no evidence for or against this, I guess, but come on. They did know each other later in life, I guess. Seagal's martial arts origins are likewise as muddied and confusing as, well, everything else about his early life. Most sources seem to agree that he did start his martial arts journey while he was pretty young. Seagal himself has given a few different stories. At one point, he claimed, while still underage, that he was working at a restaurant called The Wagon Wheel as a dishwasher. And while there, a cook who just so happened to be a martial arts expert noticed how quick on his feet Seagal was and decided to teach him the basics. There are also claims that he was trained by Fumio Demura around age 7, though that timeline just straight up doesn't work. Demura, who was apparently the inspiration for Miyagi in the Karate Kid films, as well as serving as the Miyagi stunt double, didn't actually come to America until 1965, when Seagal would have been 13. And honestly, I think it's hard to confuse something that happened at age 13 and age 7. He also claims to have begun to learn Aikido in the 60s from Harry Ishisaka. This probably did actually happen. The timelines do actually match up. I really wouldn't be surprised if this was the entirety of his martial arts training when he was younger. Really quickly, let's talk about what Aikido is. To the average onlooker, Aikido looks, well, incredibly fake. And that's because in this specific case, it kind of is. But Aikido, real Aikido, also kind of looks fake. And that's for a very specific reason. Aikido is what's known as a softer style of martial arts. It mainly focuses around using enemy momentum, but also features some grappling and joint holds. The reason you see so many displays of Aikido where people are flipping and flying around is to mainly avoid any major injuries from these different joint locks. And also, I'm sure, to make a better show. Watching people get flipped around like it's an anime is just a completely different experience than the traditional martial arts exhibition. That's a big part of why Steven Seagal actually managed to get into movies. Just looking at these two side by side, one of them just kind of looks like it would make for better action sequences in movies, even if it's a bit more unrealistic. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Steven Seagal has claimed many times that he traveled to Japan on his own when he was 17 years old. This would have been 1969 or 1970. Though, according to Fullerton College enrollment records, Seagal was actually there from the fall of 1970 to 1971. Even though Seagal claims to have trained in Japan with the founder of Aikido himself. That man died in 1969. Terry Dobson, an Aikido master who was training in Japan from 61 to 69, says that he never actually heard of Seagal during his time in Japan. Though the woman who would become his first wife, Miyako Fujitani, claims to have met him in the fall of 1974, while he was still in California. Seagal would follow Miyake back to Japan, and here he claims to open his own dojo, claiming to be the first Westerner to do so. Again, not quite reality. In fact, it was Miyake's family who actually owned a dojo, with his then mother-in-law owning the dojo and his wife actually serving as manager. He and his wife would have 2 children around this time. Okay, so married, a father of 2, living in Japan, teaching Aikido. This is where we know Steven Seagal was in the mid to late 70s. And Seagal has been pretty straightforward with this, aside from exaggerating a few things here and there. Like saying that he beat up a bunch of Yakuza, when the most his wife had ever seen him do was chase away some drunks. But according to Seagal himself, he was also doing a bit of extra work on the side. You see, it turns out that Steven Seagal was apparently working as an advisor for the CIA. Steven Seagal and Stolen Valor have a very long and storied history, so let's take a bit of a detour on his life story and get into that. Obviously, there's no readily available evidence that Seagal has done any work with the CIA, but we do have is evidence, at least in the form of stories that his former friends have told about him, that Steven Seagal really likes to take other people's stories, substitute himself in as the protagonist, and then retell those stories to other people, as if they had happened to him. There's this story hidden in an article from Spy magazine back in the early 90s. The article itself was a huge takedown on Steven Seagal and did a ton of damage to his professional reputation. Anyways, there's this excerpt where they're talking about one of Steven Seagal's former students, who was actually a Green Beret. The student tells Seagal this crazy story about his time in Laos. The student then at some point hears Seagal telling a story about his time in Laos and realizes, hey, that's actually my story. The question eventually turns to, why did people believe this? Well, there's a few different reasons. First is like, why would you lie about something like this? That's not something you'd expect from a grown-ass adult. Plus, this was the 70s and the 80s. You couldn't just Google something. If someone told you a believable lie, you might go the next 20 years believing something that we could figure out as false in 5 seconds today. But what backed it up, at least a little, was that Seagal got other people who knew that this wasn't true to back him up. Gary Goldman in particular, an actual ex-mercenary from what I've been able to find. Goldman, for a long time, seemed to corroborate a lot of Seagal's crazier CIA claims. Now, why? What does someone have to gain by keeping a lie going revolving around an, at the time, famous actor?
Money!
Eventually, there's a dispute between Seagal and Goldman. The two had been collaborating together on a screenplay, and there's kind of a spat between the two involving, of course,
money!
This leads to Goldman sending a letter to the LA Times to retract all of his previous statements, both about Seagal having anything to do with the CIA, and also, well, anything with Seagal being anything even close to a badass. With Goldman calling out a specific example. In the late 80s, Goldman, Seagal, and some other guy were all treasure hunting off the coast of Barbados, which already sounds like the plot to a crappy Seagal movie. But during this excursion, Seagal was bragging about having been a Navy SEAL, something that already doesn't fit into the timeline that we've been piecing together. According to Goldman, Seagal was so bad in the water that he was panicking and screaming about how he was going to die. And Goldman and this other guy had to physically pull Seagal out of the water by his hair to eventually get him onto the boat, with Goldman realizing later on the same trip that Seagal couldn't actually even read a compass or a map. How did Seagal react to his former friend and co-writer going public with this harsh information that most people would simply refer to as the truth? Well, he handled it about as well as you'd expect. According to Robert Strickland, someone who's known Seagal since Japan, Strickland claims that Seagal was putting forward a $50,000 hit on Goldman. And when Strickland turned it down because, well, that's an absolutely insane thing to ask of anyone, Seagal supposedly said, quote, "Get someone who will, pay them what you want, and keep the rest." Let's back up again. The year is 1980. Seagal has been living with his wife and children in Japan. Despite this being seemingly what he wanted, Seagal was still holding on to dreams of returning to Hollywood and really kicking off a career in film. Or getting into the restaurant business. I can't say if he's a good cook or not. But his wife knew about his dreams, and she scrimped and saved to help him get back to America, And after promising that he would never betray her, he took her savings, went to America, and while still trying to get his film career going, and without divorcing his first wife, he married Adrienne LaRussa in 1984. During all this time, Seagal was basically broke. He was trying to run a dojo of his own in California. His first attempt in 1980 had failed, but finally in 1988, Seagal's big break would come in the form of Above the Law, his film debut and his first starring role. And from here, his career started to take off. Aikido, even if it's not the most popular form of martial arts, makes for pretty good action sequences in films. And that's basically all these movies would be. I mean, he found what worked and kept going with that. He wasn't a strong enough actor to do any more dynamic roles and was essentially typecasted as a martial arts badass. Basically, his dreams had come true. Seagal at this point was seemingly at the top of the world. He was putting out movies pretty consistently, he was divorcing his second wife and marrying his third, and doing, well, it's hard to keep track of what exactly he was doing in his free time. He put out 5 movies from 88 to 92, and then in 93, the spy article I've mentioned once or twice throughout this video was published. This was a turning point in his career. He had just released Under Siege the year prior, what is, in my opinion, by far his best movie. It was the only one of Seagal's movies to be nominated for an Academy Award, and if you're looking at box office numbers from this point onward, the profits of Seagal's movies would begin to dip. They weren't fully negative yet, but they were well on their way. By 1998, Seagal was beginning to dip his toes into direct-to-video films. And then from 2002 onward, that was exclusively the kind of films he was appearing in. In fact, since 2002, he's only appeared in one film that hasn't been direct-to-film. 2010's Spy Kids spin-off, Machete. And while he technically stopped putting out direct-to-video films, that's only because of the rise of streaming and video on demand. And hey, who am I to say anything about an actor finding consistent work? So all I'll say about these movies is that they aren't very good. At least the ones I've tried to force myself to watch. There are mumblings online about some conspiracy theories that all of these direct-to-video and video-on-demand films are actually money laundering schemes for Russian oligarchs, which, I mean, maybe. I can't say for sure because, how would I possibly know that? I mean, I guess he's kind of close to Putin and was nominated by Putin as an honorary consul and has Russian citizenship, but again, no really solid evidence. Let's take another quick reprieve from the Seagal timeline and get into what may be my favorite controversy: his routine conflicts with various stuntmen. And just a heads up, when I say favorite, I mean because I think that these conflicts and the stories that have come out from them exemplify everything about Seagal that makes him, well, so Seagal. Believe it or not, Seagal has a very strong urge to prove just how good he is at fighting and how strong and manly he is. And that manifests itself in Seagal routinely getting into conflicts with stuntmen. Michael J. White, an actor who was routinely in films with Seagal, that he has a, what do I call it? Habit? Habit feels like not the right word. Tendency, I guess? A tendency when filming to hit stuntmen for real, which is what we would commonly refer to as a dick move. But the best example, in my opinion, is a story told by Gene LaBelle, a huge name in both the martial arts and the stunt worlds. In fact, he was supposedly the inspiration for Brad Pitt's character in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but that's somewhat of a disputed fact. Anyways, LaBelle was serving as a stunt coordinator for the Seagal film Out for Justice. Apparently while filming, Seagal was claiming that due to his Aikido training, that he was completely immune to being choked out, which is an absolutely insane claim to make. LaBelle basically calls him out on this and then proceeds to choke Seagal until he's unconscious. And then, while he's unconscious,
I pooped my pants. I did.
This, of course, has led to a very long time ongoing argument between LaBelle and Seagal, with Seagal obviously claiming that this never happened, and LaBelle never publicly confirming it either, though many people who claim to have been there give varying details of what actually happened. So while it's technically not confirmed one way or the other, all of Seagal's past actions and willingness to lie about minor things might add a bit more credence to this than there otherwise might be. Now, while all of this was happening and Seagal was slowly falling into irrelevance and putting out his own direct-to-video films, he came back with a new show and a new story. Steven Seagal, Lawman, would premiere in 2009. And according to the show's premise and its intro, Seagal, while also being at the height of his career, had begun and continued working as a police officer for 20 years. All without anyone ever finding out and no stories ever coming out that someone had been arrested by Steven Seagal. Which would have been front page celebrity news at some point, even if it was well past his career's prime. Though there's a bit more to this story than, yeah, he was a cop. According to Seagal himself, he was asked by the sheriff to train his police force in martial arts. That martial art, of course, being Aikido. And the training apparently went so well that the sheriff asked Seagal to be a reserve deputy, with him being sworn in as a deputy sometime in the late 80s. Though, of course, there's absolutely no record of this anywhere, and the Peace Officer Standards and Training Organization, which accredits police officers, had no record of Seagal being certified. And despite all of this, Seagal would still claim to have arrested bank robbers, murderers, and kidnappers. Again, no evidence of any of this. The show itself is, well, something. There's an episode where some deputy or something is worried about not passing a shooting test, so he has Seagal teach him how to shoot better, and Seagal tries to get him to do the Robin Hood thing. He shoots a target and then says, "Okay, now shoot through my bullet hole." And while watching through this, I can't tell if this is supposed to be taken completely seriously or if it's supposed to be completely absurd or some strange combination of the two. And also, this deputy or whatever really isn't that bad of a shot. He'd passed the test, which is a great way to transition into, hey, this show's fake, right? I mean, most reality shows are, well, not typically reality. Sorry to burst anyone's bubble who watches reality TV, but between the tendencies of deceptive editing, false narratives being created, and scenarios being reshot to get better reactions, you're really better off watching basically anything else that's just as fake and probably more entertaining. But that's just my personal feelings on the matter. Though if you do look at the show through that lens, it's pretty easy to see stuff like that popping up throughout. Like this scene where during a drug bust, none of the other officers are able to find what they're looking for, but Seagal of course has the bright idea to look in the oven mitts hanging on the wall, and bam, they find what they're looking for. And while there's no obvious evidence that this was a plant and a whole fake thing, I mean, come on. Let's jump ahead to the end of the show. It only ran for 3 seasons, but most of the 3rd season didn't air. That's because the show was abruptly canceled and pulled from the air. The rest of this season has never been aired and has never been seen. In fact, the season 3 episodes that did make it to air only ever aired 4 years after the rest of the series. A&E, the channel that was airing the show, has never answered or put out any statement as to why the show was canceled during the production of the show's 3rd season. Yes, there were some lawsuits surrounding sexual harassment and trafficking lawsuit brought against Seagal, but that was during the season 2 production. Season 3 was announced after that was made public. So if I had to guess why exactly production was quickly halted and the show was given the axe, I'd say there's one specific incident that we can point towards. The year is 2011. The show is in the middle of production of their 3rd season. They moved away from Jefferson Parish, Louisiana to Maricopa County, Arizona. Seagal was preparing to accompany a SWAT team going in to break up an illegal cockfighting ring. Basically an animal cruelty bust. So they, of course, bring several armored cars, a tank, and dozens of officers in full riot gear. And according to several articles I've read about this episode, the police, Seagal included, drove a tank into a house, killing a dog. They were sued for $100,000 for damages, and even if you think that, hey, the guy suing the police department for the raid that Steven Seagal was for some reason a part of obviously has every reason to lie, it is interesting to note that all charges, all 115 counts of raising gamecocks, were dropped soon after. So while there may not be a definitive answer as to why the weird show where Seagal claimed to have been a cop was canceled mid-season, it's safe to assume this probably played at least some part of it. To end this video out, there are a lot of Seagal allegations and lawsuits that have surfaced over the years. I don't feel knowledgeable or versed enough to really touch on all of those, so I'll leave a list of at least some of these accusations here on screen while I kind of talk around the topic a bit. At the beginning of this video, I talked about how, despite all the obvious lies and accusations, that Steven Seagal was still very much a part of the industry. That's really only kind of half true. With his diminishing box office returns, current reliance on video-on-demand releases, and the fact that no one really wants to work with him, he's landed firmly in the position of an outsider. One who's consistently able to find work, essentially making and remaking the same movies. There's a lot more I could have gotten into with this video. His failed business ventures, his work as lobbyist and representative for a Russian firearms manufacturer, and his weird music career. This dude put out reggae music. But with more movies still probably on the way, Seagal has definitely lived one of the strangest, most confusing careers of someone who's broken into mainstream Hollywood. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. Support us on our Patreon if you like this content and want to see more like it. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.